Okay, so I'll start again with thanking the organizers of this meeting for the opportunity to present to you some work that we have been doing lately. It's a great pleasure to be participating in a meeting in which my colleague and friend Sriram is being honored. So in contrast to the first talk that you had today, I'll be talking about something where Sriram has been involved. So it will not be very new to him, but I hope that others will find it somewhat interesting. So before going into the actual talk, I'll basically list the people who have been involved in this work that we'll be talking about for the last 3-4 years. Shiva was a postdoc in our department who did the first calculation, and he is now a faculty at University of Allahabad. Joyita was a graduate student, and she is now at Niels Bohr Institute. And among colleagues, Sriram has been involved, and Prabal Maiti has been involved. And there are a few publications in this, and more work is going on. So hopefully, I'll get to that at the end of the talk. So this term scalar activity is not perhaps very familiar to everybody. So I'll start with basically what we call scalar activity. In the usual active models, active particles interacting with each other, activity is typically represented by a now the pointer is not working. Okay. So activity is represented by a self-proportion force, but the kind of models that I'll be talking about were in some sense started by these people. Two of Shurajit and Gautam were actually our own students many years ago. In their modeling of chromosome positioning from activity-based segregation, they basically approximated difference in activity in different components by saying that these two components are connected to thermostats with different temperatures. So this is the kind of models that I'll be talking about, where there will be different components and the sort of temperature, quote unquote, associated with those components are going to be different. And this difference in the two temperatures will make the system out of equilibrium and in some sense play the role of different activity. So this kind of models have been studied, much simplified versions of the model that I was just mentioning have been studied by some people. For example, Arvind Fry and students have really looked at a BD simulation, Brownian dynamic simulation of a binary mixture of particles with different diffusivities in 2 dimensions. There is also some work by Kurt Kramer and collaborators on basically mixture of hot and cold model polymer chains. And the common thing about the results that they get in both cases is that these hot and cold components phase separate if the difference between the 2 temperatures of the 2 kind of mobilities is sufficiently large. And then Jean-François is here. He and Grossberg and also some students, I suppose, they have developed a theoretical description which in some sense gives some understanding of why this phase separation takes place. So I'll not talk much about that theory. What I am going to talk about is basically something else that sort of goes along with this phase separation. What we find is that if we have this kind of 2 temperature model, and if the particles with the hot particles and the cold particles phase separate, cold particles exhibit order which perhaps is not seen in an equilibrium system. So this is basically what I'm going to talk about, and I'll give you a couple of examples which are mostly numerical, where people have found that enhanced order in the cold component takes place under this kind of basically driving, so to speak, where the 2 temperatures are different. So the general protocol that we use in this simulations, and these were done by this couple of people that I had mentioned at the very beginning, is that we first take the particles, equilibrate it at some temperature, which we will call Tc, And then take this system, and then half of the particles then are put in contact with the thermostat at a higher temperature, TH. So these particles will be called hot particles, and these particles will be called cold particles. And there is a measure of this kind of way of driving the system by two different temperatures, which is basically obvious one, the ratio of the hot and cold temperature -1. So I'll be talking about different values of chi, which in this kind of two temperature systems will be a measure of the activity that one puts in. So as I said, there will be two. So I'll be talking about two different systems. The first system was a very simple system, which is basically a bunch of Lennard-Jones particles, but it's dense system. Well, I mean, we vary the density, but mostly I'll be talking about systems which are in the dense limit. And we put half of the particles at in contact with a thermostat at temperature TH, and the other contact with a thermostat with temperature TC. And as I just mentioned, one of the phenomena that this kind of systems exhibit is basically a phase separation. So this is illustration of this phase separation. So what we do is we look at this quantity, which I call again, you know, this is giving problems. Right. And we look at this quantity, which is break the system up into a large number of small boxes and count how many hot particles are there, how many cold particles are there in the box. And for each box, one can calculate this quantity. And this average basically is an average over the steady state that one reaches in the system. And then one looks at the distribution of this quantity psi. Homogeneous system, the distribution will be peaked around 0. Half of the particles are hot and half of the particles are cold. But as soon as there is a phase separation, this distribution will acquire some kind of a bimodal structure, and the value of this high TH, the hot particles, temperature of the hot particles, at which this breakup of the original peak occurs into a bimodal structure, that is can be identified as the value of TH at which phase separation occurs. And so using that, one gets some kind of a phase diagram. And this is a measure of the activity, as I told you. It's the difference between TH and TC, normalized by TC. And when this is small, when the two temperatures are not very different from each other, then one is in the usual mixed phase. But then as one increases that by increasing the hot temperature, then beyond a certain point, one sees this phase separation. And in between, it is, I mean, numerically, it is difficult to really figure out whether it is this kind or that kind. So one is just given some sort of error bar, so to speak, and the actual phase boundary will lie somewhere in between. So this is the phase separation part. The next thing that we see is that the same system, Lennard-Jones particles in two dimensions, and then there are two different temperatures. So this is the initial state where the cold and the hot temperature are the same, and we have a mixed system where the two kinds of particles, they're not any different. So I mean, they're all mixed up. But then as one increases the temperature associated with half of these particles to a much higher value, and then lets the system sort of evolve towards equilibration or steady state. And then one obtains this phase separation behavior, which is something that I had mentioned. But in addition to that, the cold particles get ordered, in the sense that if I look at this structure in detail, I'll find that they are forming some kind of a close-packed crystalline structure. So this phase separation is also accompanied by, at least for this set of parameters, formation of an ordered structure in the cold region of the system. And one can look at it in many different ways. One can look at, for example, this x direction is a direction which is normal to the interface. So as one is changing x, one is going from the hot to cold region and eventually coming back because it's a periodic boundary condition system. So one looks at the effective temperature, which is measured basically by the kinetic energy of the particles that we are looking at. And if you measure it as a function of x, then you will see that there is a region where it's high temperature. This is the hot region. And then there is a region where the temperature is basically is 5 in this particular case. This is the cold region. But the interface is not very sharp. That's one thing that one should notice here. One could also look at the local density. The local density also shows this variation. In the local density is high in the cold region, and local density is low in the hot region. So there is a difference in temperature. If I measure the pressure, then again there will be a difference in the pressure in the hot zone and the pressure in the cold zone. In some sense, I mean, that depends on which component of pressure you are looking at. And one has this phase separation as well as the formation of order in the cold region. And if I'm looking at the cold region and look at the density and effective temperature of the cold region, then one finds that in the equilibrium system, for those values of the parameters, the system remains in a liquid state. There is no crystallization. So somehow, in the cold region, the system is exhibiting order which is higher than what you have in a sort of isolated system where you have equilibrium and fixed temperature, density, etc. So this is what we found for the simple particle system, Leonard-Jones particles. And then the remaining 10 minutes, I will describe some other system which also exhibits similar kind of phase separation and then enhanced order. And this is a system which is soft repulsive spherocylinders. So you have cylinders and then you have spherical caps at the two ends. The length of this cylinder is L, and the diameter of this spherical cap or diameter of the tube itself is D. And the behavior, actually, we'll see that it depends very much on the ratio of these two lengths. And then, of course, they interact with each other, and there is a truncated Leonard-Jones interaction between these cylinders. And then there is some kind of packing fraction that tells you about how many of these cylinders are there in a given volume. So these are the control parameters. And then again, the student did extensive simulations. And before doing the simulations for with two different temperatures, she first looked at basically the equilibrium phase diagram, which is also known. People have done this earlier. And here, one is plotting the pressure versus packing fraction. And as we increase the packing fraction, the pressure, of course, increases. And then system, if I look at the structure of the molecules, then it will go from at low values, the packing fraction, isotropic, then to pneumatic, then to Smith decay, and eventually to a crystalline state. So these are the states that are exhibited by this system of spherocylinders interacting with this kind of repulsive interactions. And this is what is mentioned here, that this A is the ratio of L over D. As you change this A, then at equilibrium, when there is all the temperatures are same everywhere, then you will see different phases. For a value of phi, you will see all these four phases. But then people have done this extensively many years ago, where they have studied this for different values of this ratio L over D. And one finds that for a ratio of 3, one finds in simulations only these 3 phases. So pneumatic phase is missing here. And if I make the anisotropy even smaller, then only the isotropic and the crystalline phase is there. All the liquid crystal mesophases that you have in between are not present when the anisotropy or the ratio of these two distances is small. So what we want to find out is that now if we take this system for different values of this quantity, and then turn on this two temperature, that half of the particles I put in contact with heat bath at one temperature, the other half at a higher temperature, then what happens to this sequence of mesophases that the system exhibits? Again, there are lots of numerical stuff, but I will just show you a few. And then, this is the methodology that what kind of liquid crystalline phase is there present in a given region of the system that is detected by usual order parameters and correlation functions. And so this is one set of results. For L by D is equal to 5. And here the system without this scalar activity exhibits isotropic phase, pneumatic phase, Smith decay phase, and a crystalline phase. So what we do is that take in half of the particles and put them in contact with heat bath at a higher temperature. So there are these two colors. The red is basically where the particles are at low temperature. The green is where they are at a higher temperature. And similar thing we are showing here also, where what one is plotting here is the local packing fraction as a function of this parameter, which measures the difference between TH and TC. And we can see here there is phase separation, and after the phase separation, you have basically a hot region, and then you have a cold region. And in the cold region, which is basically given by these green symbols, you have this sequence of phases that you get when you increase this temperature difference. That initial density was such that everything was in a isotropic phase, but that as you increase the temperature of half of the other particles, then in the cold region, you have this different phases coming in, pneumatic, and then this is a domain crystal, a polycrystal, and then again at high densities, you get a polycrystal. So what is happening here, the initial system, everything was at density 0.4, and then temperature was the same as temperature 5. But then you are taking half of the particles and increasing the temperatures of the other half particles. And as a result, those particles which are in the original cold temperature, they are getting ordered. Because initially they were in the isotropic phase, but then as you increase the hot temperature, it's going from this higher order phases that system is going into. So this is the phenomenology that you take something which was homogeneous density and the same temperature, and then do this trick that you take half of the particles and then put them at a higher temperature. Then there is phase separation. And in the cold region, one begins to see the development of this kind of order, which was certainly not there in the original state of the system. So it's not very, very difficult to understand. What is happening here is that the hot particles in that region, they are sort of expanding in volume, and the cold region is shrinking. So the density, the local density packing fraction is increasing, and therefore one is having some kind of ordering. And as one goes in this direction, that effect increases, and one gets more and more ordered states. So similar thing can also be done where the initial state is a pneumatic phase. Then again, as you increase this parameter, it's a measure of activity. Then if you look at the cold particles, the particles which are pneumatic initially will go to the SMEC decay and then crystal and so on. It's getting ordered. Whereas, of course, the hot particles, although they were pneumatic to begin with, are in the isotropic phase. So this is the basic phenomenology that we see also in the liquid crystal system, that the degree of order in the cold region is higher than that in an equilibrium system under the same conditions. So this was the same thing when we were looking at Lennard-Jones particles that ordered into a crystalline state, which one would not see in an equilibrium system at those densities and temperatures. But here also a similar thing is happening. So that's the main message, that there is enhanced ordering. And also, I just lost. Also want to mention that if I go back to this table that I showed, depending on the value of L by D, certain liquid crystalline phases are not seen in equilibrium. But here, one of the interesting things is that one sees those phases under this two temperature kind of protocol. Just trying to go back. So for example, if I look at this ratio equal to, let's say 2, then in equilibrium, the SMEC and the pneumatic phases are absent. But then if I now do the same kind of simulation for this two temperature system, it exhibits some of these phases which are not seen in equilibrium. So just one example is here. So L by D equals 2, the pneumatic and the SMEC phases are not present in equilibrium. So if I now take this L by D equals 2 system and then put half the particles in one temperature, half the particles in the other temperature, then if the two temperature difference is sufficiently large, which is this chi equals 9, then one actually sees a symplectic A phase, which was not present in the original equilibrium system. So these are the conclusions that we get from the numerical work. So scalar activity leads to phase separation and enhanced order in the cold region that we have seen in all the numerical experiments that we have done with spherical particles as well as with rod-like objects. And for the case of spherocylinders, we find that there were certain phases that people could not find in equilibrium for a particular range of values of this anisotropy L divided by D. But in some of the simulations that we have done, we have found that those phases can be actually found by doing this trick, that heat up half of the particles. That will induce some order in the remaining half, which is cold. And the order that you can find there sometimes cannot be seen in an equilibrium system. So this is where we stand. Some other things are going on, some numerical work measuring this phase separation kinetics, also the effect of boundaries and so on and so forth. But at this point, actually, we are not very clear on the theory of this, in the sense that theory of phase separation, of course, has been done, but now we are looking at, on top of that, either crystalline order or liquid crystalline order. And so the fact that, in this case, doing this protocol, you can see ordered phases that were not seen in equilibrium, and the fact that, the cold region becomes more ordered when you heat up half of the system. Those things, Sriram has been involved in trying to find some theory with a grad student who is also here, but the work is going on. So just one comment before ending. This is last but one slide. So what I want to point out is that the phase separation is really a nice phase separation. So that the interface is very strongly localized, and you have only hot particles on that side, only hot particles, cold particles on the other side. Then as you go away from the interface, then the system looks like bulk system. So the behavior of those regions should not be very different from what you see in bulk, because all the sort of non-equilibrium effects of different temperatures is contained near the interface. But actually, in simulations, it is not the case. That and without going into details, here, for example, one is looking at eta, local packing fraction, as a function of coordinate, which is normal to the interface. And you can see that although one draws these lines to say that this is the interfacial region, it is changing very smoothly. So, and that is reflected in the fact that if you look at the thermal current will be present throughout the system. So what is happening in this cold region and in the hot region, these are not, you cannot understand that from just equilibrium considerations. You have to take into account this, the fact that you have this currents going through. So I think it would be interesting to do a calculation in which one looks at ordering in the presence of this kind of non-equilibrium currents. I'm not aware of many results in that direction, so that's one thing that we're trying to figure out. Okay, so I have finished more or less on time, and there are a few minutes for questions.
So when you said the interface is not sharp, what do you mean? Is it, does it scale with system size, or is it broader than the usual ones? Usual phase separation.
So basically, we have looked at one or two different system sizes from where it is difficult to tell you whether the interface width, given this picture, even the interface width is not particularly well defined, right? If I look at this picture, where, for example, you are looking at this kind of a variation. So what I'm saying is that, if you had something which is flat here, and then over a fixed distance changes from one value to the other and more or less flat on the other side, that I would call a sharp interface. But here, there are variations, spatial variations, which are throughout the system.
The reason I'm asking, there are some suggestion by Dibyendu Das and others that in the active system, the phase separation might be into the FDPO class, where the interface can be really broad. I mean, it scales with system size. So I'm not sure if it is.
That is in active systems where you have this activity-induced.
Vijay type part.
Oh, okay.
And can I ask one short question? Can you suppress phase separation in some ways such that one can study the glassy dynamics as well in this kind of system?
Certainly it's possible in the sense that we are looking at here, for example, the particle system. We are looking at Lennard-Jones monodisperse. So there, if the system wants to get into solid state, then typically it gets into an ordered crystalline state. But now if you have the standard tricks that people play in glass studies where you have polydispersity or you have basically two different kinds of particles interacting and so on, then the cold particles actually can go into some kind of a glassy state.
Yes, I have two questions. One is about that. If the interface is broad, does it mean that the surface tension is very low or not, compared to what you would expect if there was no chi?
I would sort of expect that, but although we have not measured that.
You haven't measured that?
We measured the surface tension, yeah.
The other one is a bit more technical. Could you go close to hard-sphere interactions? And if you take an interaction which is closer to hard spheres than the one you get, is the behavior still the same or not?
Close to what?
To hardcore.
How hardcore? Yeah.
This is tough in simulations, but
yes.
And the problem becomes a little bit ill-defined. So I was interested in.
So again, the kind of interaction that you have is of course not hardcore, but it is in the sense that the particles cannot come very close to each other. The energy becomes very large when they go beyond this particular length scale. So it is soft sphere glass to some extent, or soft sphere solid or liquid. And in the hard sphere case, what would happen is something that I will not speculate on, but do you expect something which is very different?
For hard spheres, everything is entropy, so it's a bit strange to talk about different temperatures and things like this. Yes. It's not clear how things happen at the contact between spheres, and in your case, it's pretty clear. I mean, there is longer interaction, so they exchange energy via this interaction.
So I mean, the temperatures is easy to implement, but in hard sphere, often the control parameter is some packing fraction and so on. But here it is determined by the system. I mean, we cannot play around with that.
There's also a question on how you take the limits if you make the potential hardcore or the temperatures different.
Yeah, interesting question.
In each sub-box, you count the number of cold particle and hot particle.
Yeah, that one doesn't have to, very. I mean, the size of that is not very crucial in the sense that you have to choose this size in such a way that there are of the order of 15, 20 particles in each of these sub-boxes. It cannot be too small or too large, but over that range, it doesn't really matter that much exactly what the size of the